thank you for coming today. It's a very cold day, so you've had to struggle through the cold to get here, and I really appreciate that. Let me begin by saying that this has been advertised as a master class. Well, I'm not a master, but I am going to talk about a master. So I've called it instead, on your handout, I've called it Workshop on a Master Translator, because this is about David Hawkes, and he was a real master. I'm just his student. So with those words, I think we should get started. What am I trying to do today? I think today I want to look at the translating of Hong Lo Meng as an example of basically the whole business of translation. So I've selected a few points. Now, some of you have come to my lectures before, so I apologize. I really don't have anything very new to say. So if you've heard it all before, please just read a book or, go and have a cup of tea or something. I know some of you have already heard everything I have to say before. Of course, Hong Lo Meng needs no introduction. I shan't give a kind of mini lecture about Hong Lo Meng. I shall take it for granted that you all know what this novel is, and that you all know what an enormous task it would be to translate it. And I think the world is very fortunate that David Hawkes, in 1970, decided to abandon his job as professor of Chinese at Oxford. He just resigned his job in order to translate this novel, which he'd wanted to translate ever since he was a student in Beijing, in Peking, in the late 40s. Now let me try to be clear about the division between today and tomorrow, because tomorrow at 2 o'clock I'm talking about David Hawkes as a person. I'm talking about his life and the importance of various things in his life, in his formation, in his development, his shuyang, his training as a man of letters and as a translator. So tomorrow will be about the person, and I have a lot of things to say about that tomorrow. That's at 2 o'clock. Today I'm just talking about sort of on-the-ground translation. I mean actual concrete examples. And I should start off by explaining sort of my own background and how I happen to know the stuff I know. I was extremely fortunate in 1970 when Professor Hawkes, as he still was then, invited me to become his collaborator on this huge project of translating the whole of Hong Lo Meng. And he very generously, and he was a very generous man, he very generously said to me, quite spontaneously, why don't you translate the last 40 chapters? I turned up at his door saying I wanted to come back to Oxford to do a PhD, and he said, what are you thinking of doing? And I said, oh, you know how young people can be so arrogant. I said to him, I think I'll translate Hong Lo Meng, as if it was like, the easiest thing in the world. And I remember him just looking at me from his desk, and there was a moment of silence. And then he said to me, oh, that's strange, because I've just been asked to translate it myself by Penguin Classics, and I was thinking it would be too difficult, too long. So why don't you join with me and do the last 40 chapters? That's what he said to me. I remember it very clearly. Now, some years later, a very nice postgraduate student of mine at the Polytechnic University by the name of Connie Chan, she went to Oxford to interview him. And he agreed to be interviewed, which is very rare. He was never very happy about being interviewed, but because I said, this is a very nice young lady, would you mind being interviewed? He agreed. And in the course of this interview, Connie, and some of us know Connie very well, Connie said to him, how did you end up collaborating with John Minford? I was her supervisor. And you see, the story he then told Connie was quite different from what I remembered. And he said something like this, oh, well, he wandered into my office one day looking a bit lost, and he was leading rather a sort of rambling kind of life at the time. And he said he was going to translate Hong Lo Meng. Poor chap, I felt so sorry for him, because I just agreed to do the whole thing myself. So I couldn't just, I felt so sorry for him, so I decided to just give him a chance to help. Well, he gave me the impression that he needed me, you see. He gave me the impression that without my help, he could never have done it. because that's the kind of way generous people behave. They like to make you feel you're doing them a favor. He certainly didn't make me feel like he was doing me a favor. So right from the beginning, it was a kind of collaboration between friends. We became very close friends. And so every week, this is starting in 1970, when I was only 24 years old. So every week I would go to his house in Oxford and sit there, and he would talk to me for about 2 or 3 hours, and I would go away and come back the next week and so on. So I really did sit at his feet, you know. That's the traditional way of learning. I really was his apprentice, and every week I would learn things. He never thought of it as teaching me, but he just would chat about this, that, and the other. So I learned all of this over the course of about 10 years, or more actually. And so I therefore have the enormous privilege of being able to speak, not from books, but from my own personal experience, and also from the 77 letters that he wrote me, which I still keep, which I still treasure, talking about the problems of translation. So everything I have to say is based on my own personal experience, and in that respect it's quite unique. Well, actually it's unique, because one of the things that David Hawkes taught me was that you can't say that something's quite unique. It's either unique or it's not unique. Something cannot be quite unique or very unique. It's either unique or not. So I always remember him whenever I use the word unique, because you can only say one thing, which is that something's unique or not. He was very, very precise about his use of language. Very precise. Very fussy, you'd almost say today, but I never thought it was fussy. He believed in all the old-fashioned virtues of language. For example, he would never, ever split an infinitive. But sometimes nowadays I talk to people, they don't even know what a split infinitive is. In fact, they don't even know what an infinitive is. Now, you see, I'm not going to embarrass you all by asking you if you know, but you see, an infinitive is the form of the verb like to love, to hate, to do. That's an infinitive. And if you split it, you say, it's not very nice to excessively hate somebody. That's a split infinitive, when you put a word in the middle of the infinitive and you split it. Now, of course, in today's American English, they split infinitives every 5 seconds, and it's totally regarded as correct. But in my day, when I grew up, it was almost a crime to split an infinitive. And there's lots of other things. All of this is contained in a wonderful book by a Mr. Fowler called Modern English Usage. And I always recommend it to my students, but most of them can't be bothered to read it. So, what I'm talking about is very much based on personal experience and my personal trajectory of learning, which I was extremely fortunate to have as the one and only apprentice of a very great master translator, and I can never be sufficiently thankful for that. It will always be one of those life-changing experiences that I shall be grateful for. Now, I've divided this workshop. Well, actually, it's as usual. Probably nobody else will say a word apart from me, but I can try to sort of coax you into speaking, but it will be very hard, I know, because this is not like a kind of regular workshop, and I can't be mean and identify all my former students that I know by name and embarrass them. So I'll just carry on and hope for the best. So I've divided it under certain topics, and I thought the best topic to start with would be the title of the book itself, because of course everybody knows this book as Hong Lo Meng, you know, and but then the minute you say that, you can't think how on earth to translate it into English. And that was the first problem that David and I, because we discussed all these things together, it was one of the first problems we had to deal with. And of course he was the master, I was the student, so I mean he made all the decisions. And he just felt from the start that all the previous translations were useless, you know, the dream of the red chamber, the dream in the red chamber, the red chamber dream, and so on. And if you stop and think about it, those title translations in English are grossly misleading. And we have to start off with the word red, because colors are extremely sort of significant in every culture. And if we use the word red in English, it has all kinds of connotations. But of course in Chinese it has quite different ones. And if you say red chamber to anybody, their associations will probably be of a sort of ladies' boudoir with red curtains and possibly a red light and all kinds of interesting erotic experiences taking place. Well, actually, that's not what the red chamber of the Honglo doesn't mean that at all. It's not a sort of a boudoir in some sing-song house at all. And it's actually, Honglo means the mansions of the rich and wealthy, but also the word Hong, also, as you all know, because I mean, virtually everyone except for three people here are Chinese. I mean, Hong in Chinese is a color associated with wealth, with good fortune, with beautiful women. I mean, with all kinds of nice things in life, you know. And when you say Hong Lao Meng, it doesn't mean that this is going to be a novel about a dream in a red chamber at all. It really means that, first of all, the structure of the title in Chinese has a long pedigree. Shema Shema Meng, you know, there are lots of plays, especially from the late Ming dynasty, written by Tang Xianzu, his famous Four Dreams, Si Meng, in which, you know, there's this and that dream. But what it means is that contained in that element is the concept of life being a dream. So everything is a dream. So, for example, Han Dan Meng is about the idea of life being a dream because of the story of the young man who stops in an inn and has a dream about, and life is a dream, you know, this floating life is a dream, Fu Sheng Yi Meng, you know. So all of these associations of the word dream are very important in the title. It doesn't mean it's going to be a novel about somebody falling asleep in a red chamber and having a dream about, you know, some erotic experience and waking up. That's not what it means. It means everything to do with the red mansions, which is really what the lo means, is a dream, you know. So life, all of the great illusions of life, all of the wealth, fame, glory, beauty, happiness, it's all a dream, you see. And this is what the title really means. And that's very, very hard to translate if you stick to the Chinese words. So you see, at the very beginning, David Hawkes, being an extraordinarily deep-thinking scholar, but also a very creative man, and this is what I'm trying to convey to you today. He was a scholar, but he was also a creative translator. He combined those qualities in a way which is very rare. So he thought from the beginning, how do we get away from this trap of calling it the Red Chamber Dream and misleading our readers into expecting something they won't get? And then he realized that the other title, according to which this novel is known, is Shi Tou Ji, you see, the story of the stone. And immediately he knew that was the title he wanted to use, the story of the stone, because a stone doesn't have the same sort of special cultural connotations as the color red. Of course, stones are very special in Chinese culture. On the other hand, a stone is a stone is a stone, you know. And also, there is the other idea which is important, very important to someone like David Hawkes, is that when you're creating a novel title, there are certain rules about how titles work, you know. If you look at English literature, you've got, you know, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. Now, those immediately ring as wonderful titles. I mean, Jane Austen was an extraordinary lady, and those titles work partly because of the alliteration of the title, you know, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, The Tale of the Tub. And in fact, the story of the stone has the same alliteration, you see, and it's a very memorable title. And eventually, that's what he decided to call it. Of course, the publisher, it was advised that's a bad idea because everybody knows the book as The Dream of the Red Chamber. So in the early editions, Penguin Books insisted on adding also known as The Dream of the Red Chamber, which made David Hawkes furious because he wanted to achieve a change, you see. And I think more and more now people are recognizing the book as the story of the stone. Of course, during the first chapter of the novel, Cao Sui-chin, who was the most extraordinary author, he loved playing games with his reader. You know, we know virtually nothing about Cao Sui-chin. I recently had to write a biography of Cao Sui-chin for a huge encyclopedia of Chinese biography. And I sweated over it for several months because really there's nothing we know. So I had to just base my biography on a few poems written by his friends. And it's a great irony that this man, Cao Sui-chin, wrote the greatest work of Chinese fiction, which is largely based on his own autobiographical experience. And yet, if we try to write the story of his life, we know almost nothing about him. And one of the few things that we know, well, two things that we know for sure. One is that he enjoyed drinking wine, which I enjoy drinking myself. And the second is that he enjoyed playing games. He was a great player of games. And these are facts recorded by his friends. And his friends were Manchu princes. I mean, he liked to mix with the Manchu aristocracy and go out with them for picnics, for example. And it's recorded that he enjoyed playing games, meaning, you know, games like Weiqi or, you know, that kind of real games. But you see, as a writer, he also enjoyed playing games. And in the course of that first chapter, he plays so many games with his readers. It's very, very postmodern. He keeps starting again and stopping again and starting again and having a dream and waking up in the middle of the dream and starting again. And he gives several spoof titles, I mean several alternative titles to the novel. He just throws them out as sort of deliberately puzzling. It's a deliberately very puzzling first chapter. And in fact, in the many handwritten transcriptions, they vary greatly from each other because he quite clearly kept changing his mind about that very first chapter. And in the course of that chapter, he mentions several titles of the book, one of which, yes, was Hong Lou Meng, and another was Shi Tou Ji, the story of the stone. But he also mentioned another title, Qing Seng Lu, the record of the monk of feeling. Now, David translated that as, I think he called it the story of Brother Amor, A-M-O-R, Brother Amor. You see, right from the start, you can see he's really enjoying himself. I mean, I remember once some advice written by a very fine English essayist, I think it was G.K. Chesterton, who said, the moment an author stops enjoying himself, you can tell, and that's when you stop reading. And I think the great thing about David Hawkes is that he enjoyed himself from the beginning to the very end of his work. And his as I think I mentioned in an earlier lecture, he once sat down with me and said, John, you know why we're doing this, don't you? And I said, no, why? Because I was terribly young and ignorant. And he said, John, we're doing this for the sheer hell of it. Now, a lot of people, when I say that, they don't really understand what it means, because it's got nothing to do with hell. You know, it doesn't mean it was hell to translate Hong Lou Meng. It means when you say you do something for the hell of it, it means you just have to do it. You just can't help it. You do it because it's just a necessary experience. You've just got to do it for the hell of it, you see. And it's a very idiomatic English expression, but he used it about this novel. And everything he did, every problem he encountered, he just found a way of solving it creatively because he was having such a good time. He couldn't stop living and breathing this novel. And when he finally got to the end of his first 80 chapters, he was so miserable because he had to stop translating Hong Lou Meng that he wrote to me in Australia and said, John, I know you won't like this, but I'm really suffering from Story of the Stone deprivation. Would you mind if I translated some of your chapters just to keep myself happy? And I said, I'm sorry, David, they're mine. You know, much as I love you, these are my chapters, and I will do them myself. I'm sorry. He was very disappointed. I wouldn't let him, you know, he would never have revealed it to anybody else. He would have just done it, and I would have then been expected to pass it off as my own work. I wasn't happy about that, so I refused. But you see, he really missed it. He lived and breathed. I mean, he'd write me letters saying, for example, I walked down Oxford High Street yesterday, and I bumped into so-and-so, and as Zhao Baoyu would have said, it was just like so-and-so. I mean, he was almost reincarnating Zhao Baoyu, you see. He lived it every moment of the 10 years he spent translating the first 80 chapters. It was part of his life. He lived it. He loved it. He loved to play games with the translation. And later on I shall give you some examples of how he liked to play with it, how he liked to have fun. He was a little bit crazy, I think. Now, the second in my list of topics is the translation of names. This is a very old topic. In fact, somebody's written a whole PhD about it, which is intensely boring. Really, you can say everything in about one page, but that's the essence of today's PhDs, is to turn something that you could say in one page into about a 500-page PhD with lots of theory attached to it, you see. And there really is no theory at all. He just had a good idea, because it's very practical. Now, I think the one other extremely important aspect of David's work as a translator is that he cared about his readers. He really cared about them. He wanted to give them something very special. He wanted to share with them his intense pleasure at reading and translating this novel. I mean, he was really a Hong Lemong fan, you know, and he was crazy about the novel. And that motivated him to find real solutions to real problems. And, you know, if any of you have, well, I'm hoping some of you have read the novel, but I mean, you know, immediately, whether you're Chinese or English or French or German or Japanese, it really doesn't matter. One of the immediate problems is just that there are so many people, you know. I mean, supposing I wrote a novel about all of you, you know, there's probably about 50 people here. I mean, it would take me about a week, at least, to work out who you all are, and then your names, you know, because of course Chinese names are very funny, you know. They're not like English names. You don't have Tom, Dick, and Harry. Every name is different. And then when you start to invent English names for yourselves, they also become equally interesting. And I've had the pleasure of meeting two young ladies here from the Public Relations Office, and one of them is called Angel, and the other is called Apple. Well, you see, Apple is not really a name according to normal English usage, but I mean, I think it's a very creative idea to invent interesting names for yourself in English. And in Chinese, of course, there's almost an unlimited range of possible names. Some of them have got references to the classics. Some of them are political, you know. If you want to call yourself Jian Guo, you know, building the nation, you know when your parents were born, you know, and so on and so forth. And so names have a very different cultural function in Chinese. And you know, when Cao Xueqin was called Xueqin, that wasn't his real name. I mean, his real name was Cao Zhan, and people have got theories about why he was called Cao Zhan. It's to do with the favor granted to the Cao family by the emperor. And you know, when he called himself Snow Parsley, you know, Xueqin, I mean, that's also got a whole story attached to it. Well, in the novel, it's a bit like walking into this room and suddenly having to meet 50 different people. And if it's difficult for Chinese people, imagine how difficult it is for English people who think that all Chinese names sound the same, you know, Ching Chong Chinaman, very, very sad, you know, that kind of thing. All Chinese names are very, very hard to remember for English-speaking people. They really are. They have trouble even remembering Deng Xiaoping, you know. And I mean, you know, Xi Jinping, names like this. I mean, you listen to the news broadcasters on you know, foreign language television stations, they almost always get the names wrong. And so when you're dealing with a novel where you really, especially a novel about people, because if there's one thing that everybody agrees about, is that Hong Lemong is a novel about people. And those people are so real that they almost like live in your house, you know. And they really have become super real. So, for example, I once took David to meet some friends in Australia, and this is a very nice friend, a Belgian professor called Pierre Rickmans, and his wife, Chinese wife, her name is Han Feng. She's still alive. Pierre has passed away. But when we had lunch with them, and when we got back into the car, David just turned to me and he just said one word. He just said, Wang Xifeng, right? And you see, because Wang Xifeng is so real that you only have to mention that name and you've already spoken volumes about somebody, you see. Or if somebody was to come and meet me and go off and mutter to his friend as they left the room, oh, Jia Bao you know what they're trying to say about me, and so on. And if I turn around to somebody and say, Hua Xi Ren, aroma. Well, I mean, because these people are so real that they become real friends and real personalities. And so Hawkes was he really wanted to help the English reader to get to know these people as real people. And immediately he had the problem of names, because you pick up a page of Hong Lau Meng, it's just covered in Chinese names, and so he approached it with a very friendly eye. He really wanted to help. So in the end, I remember when he was evolving this method, he wrote me a long letter saying, "Dear John, I think at this early stage I should let you know what I'm planning to do about Chinese names." And he worked out a whole method. He was a very methodical person, unlike me. And for example, in the papers that I donated to the library at Chinese University, there's a large sheet of paper like this, covered in different shades of watercolor paint, because he was also a painter. He liked to paint. But when he started becoming a watercolor painter, he was very methodical. So he organized all the colors. I think there were 47 different shades of color. And it was the same with names. I mean, he decided we've got to help the reader, so I'll divide the characters up into different categories. So he decided all the members of the family and all the upper class people, in other words, all the sort of important actors in the story who were members of the upper class, he would use Chinese. So he'd call Jia Baoyu, he'd call him Baoyu, B-A-O-Y-U. And Lin Dayu, he'd call her Dayu, you see. And that way, the reader would immediately know that people whose names were written in Romanized Chinese, these were upper class members of the story, members of the cast. And then he decided he would translate into English the names of all the maids and servants, so that people would immediately know that if someone's called Skybright, that's going to be a maid, you see. And if someone's called Aroma or Ripple, that's going to be a maidservant. Or if they're called Tea Leaf was a page boy. Ming Yan, he was Jia Baoyu's page boy. So you immediately have you're helping the reader. Well, first of all, by translating the name, you're making it easier, but also you're indicating that they're a member of a certain class. And then he decided that for the people who are in some way religious, monks or priests, he would use either Latin or Italian. So, for example, the famous monk Kong Kong Dao Ren, right, becomes Vanitas, right, which is the Latin for vanity. And I've listed a few others. And then when he got to the category of people who are slightly naughty, and that included actors and actresses and sing-song girls, being typically English, he decided to use French because, the English always regard the French as being rather naughty. So, for example, there's a sing-song girl, and he calls her nuageuse, like a cloud, you see. And all the actors have names like Trésor and Topaz. He was playing games, you see. He was having a good time. From the first page to the last page, he was having a good time and enjoying himself and playing games with his reader, just like Cao Sui-chin. So much for names. Oh yes, but while we're on the subject of names, let me mention the question of Romanization. Romanization is a very peculiar thing, and it's something that every translator has to deal with. And nowadays the world is encouraged, well, not encouraged, obliged, bullied into using Hanyu Pinyin, which is a system basically imposed upon its own people and then upon the world by the Chinese Communist Party. Long may they, whatever, rot. So Romanization is a real problem because it's a way of turning Chinese into non-Chinese. So it's really basic to the process of translation. And when David typed out the first 10 or more chapters of the story of the stone, he used the old Romanization, which is usually referred to as Wade-Giles. And you see, according to that Romanization, Baoyu would be spelled P-A-O-Y-U with an umlaut. And Bao Chai would be spelled P-A-O-C-H'-H-A-I, and so on. And he was actually more in favor of that system of Wade-Giles because he didn't like Hanyu Pinyin. I don't like Hanyu Pinyin. I don't like Jianti Zi, but those are different issues. However, let's not get into that today. So he'd been using Wade-Giles, and we used to talk about it. And I'd say to him, well, David, I know we don't either of us like Hanyu Pinyin, and we always want to call the capital of China Peking, you know, and not Beijing, and written in Pinyin. And he felt that very strongly. But then I said to him, but don't you think that in the future, unfortunately, all the world will have to use Hanyu Pinyin? And his answer to that was, frankly, I don't care. I don't care. I want to use the best system that will be most in tune with our project. But then one week, he turned to me and said, John, I've changed my mind. I'm going to use Pinyin. I'll tell you why. And his reason was very simple, nothing to do with theory, very practical. He said, if I use Wade-Giles, most readers who don't know Chinese will pronounce Baoyu as Pao-Yu, right? P-A-O-Y-U. And they'll pronounce Bao Chai as Pao Chai. And they'll pronounce Dai-Yu as Tai-Yu, because that's what those letters mean. And I really don't want my favorite people to be mispronounced. So at least for those three names, Pinyin is better. So we ended up having to correct the typescript of the first 10 chapters. I sat there for hours with him, helping him to correct it. And, you know, I don't think it really matters in the end. Romanization is not the most important issue. But that was how he decided. It was a very practical decision based on what he thought readers would say when they read the book aloud. And you see, now that it's all in Hanyu Pinyin, the author's name is, of course, C-A-O-X-U-E-Q-I-N. So it has the three worst letters in Hanyu Pinyin, C, X, and Q. And I have literally heard people walk into a shop and say, have you got that Chinese novel by Mr. Cao Xue Quinn? Because that's what it looks like. And it's just most unfortunate, but I mean, we have to work with what's possible. So he used Pinyin. Now the third topic on this list is perhaps the most interesting and the most revealing in terms of David's approach to translation. You see, and it's all connected with the fact that Cao Xueqin liked to play games. I mean, in one sense, the whole of Hong Meng is an elaborate game, you know, because he's playing with the idea that fiction and memory and illusion, and they're all part of the same texture of life, you know. Are we really all sitting here in this hall today, or are we just dreaming, you know? And if we're dreaming, is somebody else dreaming that they're us, or are we dreaming that they're, you know, the old Zhuangzi and the butterfly thing. And the whole of Hong Meng has this extraordinary paradoxical relationship between intense realism. Never has a novel been written with so much attention paid to the detail of every life, to the clothes, to the jewelry, to the makeup, the hairdos, everything like that, the food, the furniture. It's so amazingly real, and yet the end result is that the whole thing seems very dreamlike, and that's one of the essential qualities of this novel. And as part of Tsar Sui-chin's extraordinary obsession with levels of reality, because that's what the novel's about. What is real? Zhen and Jia, Jia Zuo Zhen Shi, Zhen Yi Jia, what is real and what is false, and what is not real. As part of Tsar Sui-chin's extraordinary means to create this masterpiece, his playful means, he used to play around with words. And some people love to play around with words. And it's to do with their attitude towards life, It's to do with their imagination interfering with their daily life. Something which, happens to a lot of people, sometimes in almost excessive ways. Now, this was one of Tsar Sui-chin's main modes of thinking and writing. And at the very beginning of the novel is the most famous example, when he's talking about the so-called stone, I mean, the beginning of the novel is quite extraordinary. I'm sure you all know it. But there's this stone which is lying at the foot of a mountain because it was not considered fit to repair the sky. The stone that was rejected, you see, which later becomes Jiao Baoyu. And it's lying at the bottom of this mountain, and he calls it the mountain, the Qinggong Feng, the peak of literally the green channel or gully. And we know from the wonderful Zhi Yanzhai, the wonderful commentator who was a member of the family, no one knows who he was, or she was. Possibly, there's so many theories, I won't get into that now. But we know that when he wrote this, Tsar Sui-chin was deliberately playing on words, and that the so-called green peak, the Qinggong, was really a pun on Qing, meaning I Ching, the Qing, feeling, and Gun, meaning root. And in a sense, you see the whole root of Jiao Baoyu's destiny, the whole basis of his personality was in his almost obsessive cultivation of feeling, of Qing. This was the root. This is what lies at the root of the whole novel, you see. And this genius of a writer signals this from the very first page of his novel. This is his secret message, you see. And he uses this play on words because he was playing a game right to the very end of the novel, including the last 40 chapters, which I believe contains a great deal of his original work. He was playing a game, but he was saying to his readers, this is a game, but don't think it's a stupid game. It's a very, very important game, because games are important, because life is a game, And don't be too serious about it, because you'll be making a terrible mistake if you're too serious about my book. And unfortunately, a huge majority of so-called Hong Sui Jia make that terrible mistake of taking the book too seriously. But Hawkes was concerned with trying to preserve the game-like quality of the novel. And I want to jump to my fifth point, which is what I've called cultural sleight of hand. And those of you who came to my lectures a few years ago at Chinese U will remember how I talked about this. Cultural sleight of hand, sleight of hand is what happens when a conjurer produces something and you think it's a miraculous thing, but actually they're playing a trick on you. So they're using sleight of hand to create an effect which has a deeper resonance. And what Hawkes does again and again and again in his translation, and I could write a whole book about it because it happens on almost every page, is that he translates in such a way that Western culture, especially of course English culture, is used as a mirror image of Chinese culture in such a way that it helps the reader to penetrate to a deeper level of meaning. And I'd like to give you one, what I think is a particularly subtle example, which I've never really talked about before. But there's the most wonderful scene in the second volume of the translation. I think it's chapter 27, but correct me if I'm wrong, those of you who know the novel better than me. It's a wonderful party. Takes place in the house of a person called Feng Ziying, who's one one of Jia Bayu's, I almost said Sa Sui Chin, but one of Jia Bayu's friends, who's a party goer, and he likes to throw wonderful parties. And he throws this wonderful party to which he invites all his friends, including, of course, Bao Yu, but also including Xue Pan. Xue Pan is one of my favorite characters in the novel. You know, everyone says he's terrible, but I would like to spend the evening with Xue Pan. He knows how to drink. He knows how to make a fool of himself. He's probably a horrible person. I mean, he does some terrible things, but he's great fun. And you feel that Sa Sui Chin describes him with affection. And in this particular party, he makes an absolute fool of himself. But the point I want to get to is that they also invite a sing-song girl, right? Do any of you know the origin of the word sing-song girl? Any Shanghai people here? No. Yes, but I mean, you probably don't even know. No? Everyone thinks that the word sing-song girl is because these ladies would sing songs, you see, and entertain their clients. In the flower houses and so on, the so-called qinglo, the greenhouses, you know, and you see, actually, the expression "sing-song girl" and "sing-song house" originated in Shanghai in the late 19th century, because if any of you have seen the wonderful movie by Hou Xiaoxian called Hai Shan Hua, you'll see a superb recreation of that world. And they refer to the girls as xiansheng, you see, xiansheng. And so the foreigners heard them say in Shanghai Hua, xiansheng, xiansheng, you know, and they thought they were saying sing-song, so they called them sing-song girls. But you see, it originates from the expression xiansheng, used of the very high-class courtesans in the flower houses. Anyway, I'm rambling on, and Leo Lee isn't here to thank me for my rambling. So. Basically, at this wonderful party of Feng Ziying's, where everybody has to sing songs and get well and truly drunk. And Hawkes has the most wonderful time translating the songs. Some of them sound like Cole Porter, you know, really wonderful imitations of Cole Porter, which is another cultural sleight of hand, and a rather obvious one. And some of them sound like sort of good old deep South blues and so on. And but there's the nuageuse, you see. Nuageuse is the girl from the sing-song house, and Xue Pan is always being much too familiar with her and sort of slapping her on the bottom and saying, "Come on, darling, sing us a song." And she says, "Go on with you, you old devil." And so it's a very, very funny scene, and they all get drunk, and then nuageuse sings. Now, when nuageuse, and her Chinese name is Yun, right? Yun meaning cloud, you see. She's called Miss Cloudy, you see. So David wants to use the French to indicate that she's not very respectable, because actors and actresses and sing-song girls, they're part of what used to be called the demi-monde, you know, the sort of slightly less respectable but very enjoyable level of society. And of course the French were always much better at that than the hypocritical English, you see. So Nuageuse, she came from a sing-song house. I don't think he calls it a sing-song house, but what was the name of the sing-song house, you see? And I've even forgotten the Chinese name now, but it doesn't even matter, because he doesn't translate it at all. Instead, he calls it the Budding Grove, which has no relation to the Chinese at all. And I was always a bit puzzled about it. Why would he call the sing-song house the Budding Grove? And then I just sort of thought, well, I don't know, he was just sort of having a senior moment or something. But then I realized later on that there's a very, 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 very important reason, and I could write an article about it, but I can't be bothered. But the reason is that there's a very wonderful novel by Marcel Proust called À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time, which was translated wonderfully in the 1920s as In Remembrance of Things Past by Scott Moncrief. And one of the volumes of Proust, which in French is called À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleurs, literally in the shade of young girls in bloom, is translated by Moncrief as Within a Budding Grove. And that would be the immediate association that anyone who had read Proust would have with the name of the brothel or the flower house from which Nuageuse has been hired. David just called it the Budding Grove. Now, why on earth would he do that, you know? I mean, it's got nothing to do with the Chinese name, which meant something quite different. I can't remember the name now, but I know it's not a translation. The reason is quite simply this, and I know this because I've heard him say it to me several times. He used to say, John, Hong Lemong will never be a novel that lots of people will read, you know. It'll always be a novel in English for a minority of special readers, and those are the people that we're writing for. He said it's a bit like Proust, you know, and of course his favorite novel apart from Hong Lemong was Proust. So, you know, out of sheer mischief, out of sheer playfulness, he wanted to drag in a reference to Proust, you see. And I mean, I don't think anyone's even noticed. So I mean, the point, I think maybe I'm the only person who noticed, but now I'm telling other people, so everybody will notice. But I mean, it's his way of saying, Hong Lemong is like Proust. I'm not going to give you a footnote. I'm not going to write an article about it and get promoted to associate professor or whatever. I'm just telling you in a very sort of playful way that Hong Lemong is like Proust. Do you get it or do you not get it? If you don't get it, tough luck. If you do get it, you'll realize that Hong Lemong is a novel about memory. It's about reconstructing the entire world of the past. It's an absolutely marvelous novel written by a very extraordinarily weird person who hardly ever left his bed, you know. But I mean, and in many respects it's quite different from Hong Lemong, but in some very important respects it's very similar. And he's giving you this little subtle hint, you see, in a way that nobody would necessarily notice, but they will now because I've told you. One of the absolutely essential decisions that David made from the very start was that we were not going to use footnotes. And that was not because he wanted to be smart or, you know, non-academic. It was quite simply, again, because he was thinking about his reader and about the fact that when you're reading a novel, what matters most of all is the spell that the novel casts, the way it makes the reader abandon any disbelief and enter into a world of fiction which is really magical. And the minute you start having footnotes, you puncture that bubble. You sort of, the reader goes, oh, and looks to the bottom of the page. And so he made that decision, but sometimes there are things that need explaining quite badly. So he decided to go out of his way to explain things, but to weave it into the main part of the translation. So that is what is referred to not just by me but by other people as the incorporated footnote. And almost every page has got an incorporated footnote. And it was actually not a technique that he invented. It was used by an earlier translator for Penguin Classics, who was also a great poet, called Robert Graves. And Robert Graves translated a great deal of stuff from the Latin and also from the Greek. And he himself called it the incorporated footnote, where you add the information in, but you smuggle it in without having to wake your reader up from the dream of the book. You see, David wanted to translate Hong Lemong into a novel. He wanted it to become a novel that people would enjoy reading, you know, that they wouldn't be able to put down. And one of the things he did in order to achieve that was to use the whole range of English novel writing language. You know, there are certain ways in which novel writers, especially traditional ones, they begin and end a chapter, or they sort of talk to the reader. And when the very first two words of Hong Lemong, as I'm sure you all know, the first two words of Hong Lemong are kan guan. Kan guan means, you know, reader, basically, the gentleman reading this book. And without any hesitation, David simply translated that as gentle reader. Gentle reader, because that's what 18th century novelists used to say when they were addressing their reader. Gentle reader, may I for a moment, you know, people like Henry Fielding or Lawrence Sterne, the great novelists, Smollett, the great novelists of the 18th century. That's the kind of language they use. And if you look at the last page of each of the 5 volumes of the translation, suddenly, out of nowhere, you see a line of Latin. And it says, I've given you one of it says, for example, under number 7 on my first page, explicit pars prima lapidis historiae. Well, I mean, it's Latin. And stuffy people would say, what the hell is he doing introducing Latin at the end of his first volume? And it just means in Latin, here ends the first part of the story of the stone. And I use a lot of Latin in my part, and I've been severely criticized for doing that. But I mean, the point is that in the traditional world of the English novel, right up until the end of the 19th century, and even into the 20th century, the writer assumed that his reader could understand Latin, and it became part of the sort of part of the polished exterior of a novel would be that you could use the occasional word of Latin, and everybody would be expected to know what it means. So David wanted to add these little things to his translation to give them a kind of antique shine, And when I did my I Ching, I used a lot of Latin, and thanks to the expert editing of my wife, I removed about 90% of it before it got published, because I started to put more and more Latin in, just because I was enjoying myself so much, because I studied so much Latin in my youth, when I should have been enjoying life much more. I thought at least now I can use it. So I used a bit. Even the small bit I used has been attacked in the press. But you see, Latin is a very special language, which is at the root of all Romance languages in Europe. And people like David and myself, who misspent their youth studying Latin and Greek, we're left with a kind of, a rather mischievous desire to inflict it on other people, Like Pu Songling spent his life studying for the Chinese exam system, and therefore he played with that in his Liao Zhai stories, you see. So I can see again that in doing this, in putting these little Latin tags at the end of each volume, David was having fun. He's allowed to have fun, and thanks to him having fun, his readers now can have some more fun. And it's all about having fun. I'm not supposed to say that. My point number 8, thank goodness I've numbered them, otherwise I'd get completely lost myself. My point number 8 I've called So Many Smiles. Now, again, if you've read Hong Lemeng, you'll know that on almost every page it says 什么什么孝道, Wang Fu Ren Xiao Dao, or Jia Mu Xiao Dao, or whatever. And I mean, if every time you translate that as said with a smile, you're simply reinforcing the mistaken Western conception that all Chinese people spend their lives smiling, and what's called the inscrutable Chinese smile, which means actually nothing at all. I mean, and so David started very early on adding adverbs. So if the Chinese said, Wang Xifeng xiao da, he might translate it as, and Wang Xifeng smiled slyly, or smiled enigmatically, or something like that. And I mean, I can list about 100 ways in which he qualified the smile. And of course, I mean, I assumed he was brilliant and had the right answers to everything, because he was my great master and teacher. But once I plucked up my courage and said to him, David, why do you do that? Why do you keep adding words to the smiles? I mean, they're not in the Chinese. And he said, John, it's obvious, can't you see? I said, no, I can't, otherwise I wouldn't ask you. So he, being a very kind person, he said, well, I'll explain to you. And his explanation was very down to earth, very human. He said, when you translate dialogue, you always lose something. You get to the end of a long piece of dialogue and you always feel, oh God, yes, that's the words, but where's the real tone of voice? Where's the underlying, the subtext? I can understand why Wang Shifeng's speaking like that, because she's just, for example, when Wang Shifeng decides to destroy that poor man Jia Rui, who she leads on, she seduces and then destroys, and the poor man dies, in bed, in a fever of kind of sexual excitement, because she's led him on and dumped him at every stage of the way. And she's a monster. But the point is that every time she speaks, especially Wang Shifeng, every time she speaks, there's a tone of voice that Sai Sui-Chin manages to convey, because he's a master of dialogue. He writes the most superb dialogue, and he creates personality and character. But in dialogue, he creates tone of voice. That's the sign of a true master. And when you translate brilliant dialogue, for example, Oscar Wilde, it's what a nightmare. And you always get to the end of the paragraph and you think to yourself, yes, that's not bad, but I still haven't got the real tone of voice. So David said, we lose so much every time we translate dialogue that I decided to try and put something extra back in by describing the smile whenever there's a xiao da. So I thought that was a very, very good explanation of why he's doing it. Again, you wouldn't be able to construct a theory around that. It's just a practical decision that he made to try and help his reader capture the essence of the novel. Point number 10, I'm sort of jumping from one to the other because I won't have time. Talking of which, what is the time actually? There's the clock, right? It's just after 7. After this point, we'll stop for a brief break. Translation is a practical business, You're not just sitting in your study reading a book and having beautiful thoughts and writing some completely pointless article about it. You're actually trying to translate something. And it's to do with the real world of books and publishing especially. But there are certain things you can do as a translator which you can either profit from them and make something out of it, or you can just treat them as a boring thing. For example, Penguin Books decided to divide the novel into 5 volumes. Now in Chinese it's not divided at all, it's just 120 chapters. So once the publisher had decided that they had to split it up into 5 volumes, because otherwise the books would be simply too big, then the translators, both of us, we had to decide how to package them, you see. And so in the end, David and I, we each created separate titles for each of the 5 volumes. And of course some English readers think that those titles were created by the original author, but they weren't. And so when he called the first volume The Golden Days and the second volume The Crab Far Club, he was actually inventing a kind of packaging for the novel. And it's a kind of freedom, if you like, but it's a kind of creative intervention. I want to go to the bottom of my first page and introduce the notion of recasting. Now this is not a very commonly used word, but what do I mean by recasting? Of course, this goes back to the use of the word cast when you create something out of metal or out of bronze, something like a bell or a cauldron, let's say, and you take the metal and you melt it down into a certain shape. But the idea of recasting is like that you take that existing object made of metal and you melt it down, and then you transform it into a different shape. And I used it here as a kind of figure of speech for the way in which a fine translator such as David Hawkes takes the original Chinese text and works on it on a sort of level which is in fact very deep, so that he takes the words and then transforms them so that they re-emerge in a new language. But their essence is still the same essence. The molten metal is still the same molten metal that was used to create the first vessel, but now it's been melted down into a different vessel, but the essential ingredients are the same. So it's a way of saying it's what the great writer Qian Rongshou described in his essay on the translations of Lin Shu, of Lin Qinnan, and he said that in addition to Yan Fu's 3 qualities of translation, the Fan Yi San Nan of Xin Da Ya, he added the word hua, and of course hua means to change, but it's also the word used in the modern binome huaxue, or chemistry, and the idea of the changing, the alchemical change of transformation of one metal into another, which is at the root of alchemy, is applied by Qian Rongshou, and he rather associates that idea with the concept of reincarnation, so that a translator is in a sense becomes the reincarnation of the original writer, because he's able, or she is able, to transform the essence into a new form by virtue of being so closely identified with the original author that they can do that. Now, I've given, in fact, I think I circulated it to people as a kind of preliminary reading. I've taken a short passage which comes in one of the so-called prefaces to the Honglameng, and David translates it in his introduction. And I'm not going to linger on this because we could spend 2 hours at least going over it. What I've done is to give you the whole Chinese, it's like a short essay really, a short piece of classical Chinese. It's almost written in classical Chinese, and in which the author spells out his inspiration, the reason why he's written Honglameng. That's why it's so very precious, because he's actually stating how he came to write the novel. And I think Hawkes was particularly struck by this short passage and spent and devoted a huge amount of energy to translating it. And what I've done is I've divided the translation on page 3 into lettered sections going from A right the way through to Z, and then starting again with A1. So I often did this with students over the years. You take the English, and then you try to point out where exactly it comes from in the Chinese, because his translation doesn't follow the Chinese word for word. It doesn't even necessarily follow the order, but what he does is to recast it. And many years later, when he was helping me to translate the novels of Jin Yong, David demonstrated what he meant. In the case of Jin Yong, he considered it to be greatly inferior to Honglameng, so he could recast a whole chapter. He could read a whole chapter in one breath, because he thought it was rubbish, you see, basically, just cheap popular fiction. So he'd read a whole chapter, and then he'd close the book and sit down and rewrite it all in English, because that was A, quicker, and B, more effective. Now, in the case of Honglameng, of course, he wouldn't do that, because it's a book of enormous craftsmanship, and each word is there for a reason. But I think something of the same principle is at work, which is you take it in one breath, maybe 2 or 3 sentences, and then you sort of put it aside, and you digest the original, and you let it, you sort of transform it in your inner being, and then you try to re-express it in English. And that is what I call recasting. And I think, I would urge you, if you wish to study this, to go back at some point. I mean, don't go back now, I'm sure you have better things to do, but at some point when you have an idle moment, just have a glance at this passage and at his translation. And then, by way of comparison, I've provided the translation on page 4, the translation by Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang. Now, I don't normally get into this business of comparing David Hawkes with Yang Xianyi and his wife, but I think in this case it's really very instructive, because theirs is a very plain, very uninspired, very accurate translation that follows the order of the Chinese words very closely, and that when necessary adds a footnote, which of course David would never have done. And I think that you can tell a great deal about the two translations by looking at this. Now I want to add something today which I haven't been able to do much in the past, which is to quote from letters that Gladys Young wrote to David. Now, as I think you're aware from my lecture on Arthur Waley, I do treasure things like letters very much as real documents revealing the true process of whether it's writing or translation or even life. And I regret that nowadays people don't write letters more, because I think they were always a very important part of life. And you see, Gladys was a good friend of David's. Gladys was the first student to graduate in Chinese from Oxford University back in the late 1940s after the war. And it was when she was a young student at Oxford that she met the young Yang Xianyi, who was a very wealthy. His father was the head of the Bank of China in Tianjin, and whenever Xianyi needed money, he just asked Daddy to cable him more money. So Xianyi was a real playboy in Oxford, and he was famous for saying to his friends, he was at Merton College, and he'd say to his friends, "Let's go to Paris for the weekend." And his friends would say, "But we haven't got the money to go to London, let alone Paris." And Xianyi would say, "Don't worry, I'll pay for everything." And they'd all go to Paris, and Daddy would cable him some money to the bank, and it was all taken care of. And he was from a very wealthy family, and he was happy to spend money to enable his friends to have a good time. And he was also rather good looking, and he would wear a traditional Chinese gown, so he cut a rather romantic figure in Oxford in those days. And before anyone, and Gladys was a very beautiful young woman, and she was already engaged to a young man. But before anyone knew what had happened, she ran away with Xianyi. I mean, he just whirled her off her feet, and the next thing everyone knew, they'd gone to China, and they spent the rest of their lives in China. And they were the most wonderful couple. I knew them very well, and very grateful to them because they were so hospitable and so friendly and nice. But you see, they never wanted to translate Honglameng. They were obliged to translate it by the political situation in China, and it was considered to be an important task. And they'd spent 7 years in solitary confinement during the Cultural Revolution, and it was almost a duty they had to perform as part of their release from prison. And I know personally that they didn't like the novel very much. I once sat on the beach with Gladys at Beidaihe, and she spoke to me at some length about her disapproval of Jia Baoyu. She thought he was rather a silly, sentimental young man, and that he would never have joined the Communist Party for a start. And despite all their maltreatment, they remained committed socialists and very patriotic and so on, in their own funny way. They preferred a book like Rulin Weisha, or a rather more witty, satirical approach to life, drier. They thought Honglameng was terribly sentimental, so they wouldn't have chosen to do it, but they were more or less forced to do it. And it's very interesting because Gladys wrote many letters to David during the 1980s, after the translation was published. And I never knew about those letters because David gave them all to Francis Wood, who's the librarian, or was the librarian at the British Library in charge of Chinese. And only recently they've come to light, and they're fascinating documents. And I've given you a couple of quotations here from those letters. The top of page 5, she wrote in February 1975, she wrote, "Our press," that's the foreign language press, the Waiwenju, "has now definitely decided to go ahead with the dream." And then they've been given a prominent scholar, Wu Shechang, to cooperate with their translation. And Gladys wrote, "This is of course a great asset. It has its disadvantages too, as he tends to be pedantic and wants to produce the definitive scholarly translation. To him, readability is of much less importance." Well, you see, nothing could be more different. I mean, David and I well, especially David, we did it for the hell of it, not because anybody else was forcing us to, but because we absolutely passionately wanted to do it. And we did it despite formidable obstacles. We had no money, we had no support of any kind, but we were just absolutely determined to do it. And we loved it, and we had a wonderful time doing it. The very opposite was true of Gladys and Xian Yi. And then the second quotation, in 1977, Gladys received the second volume from David Hawkes, which she read with much relish. She confided to Hawkes that she read his translation with a mixture of admiration and envy, comparing your felicitous rendering with our flat-footed translation. You take well-warranted and judicious liberties to make things clear to your readers, and this is excellent, but not something we are allowed to do. This is extremely revealing, this letter. She went on praising Hawkes. And your dialogue is alive and in character. Your verse is easy and elegant. Some of those bloody poems, studied with classical allusions and double meanings, are untranslatable in full, but at least you convey the flavor and give readers an idea of what the poetizing game is like. So, she was very, very frank, and so was Xian Yi. They both said to me, we think that your translation is infinitely better than ours, because your translation is so much more alive and so much more fun. And they were under instructions all the time from different scholars and the party secretary and so on as to how to do the translation. And it was the absolute kiss of death, really. I think I should go back and just cover a couple of points that I skipped over at the beginning. One of them is point number 9 about how to translate Chinese medicine. It's really hard. I mean, in Hong Lao Meng, there are several scenes which involve traditional Chinese doctors coming to examine patients and diagnose them and prescribe medicine for them. And David worked out how he wanted to do it. And it's very interesting if you look at it, because what he does is he uses the language of traditional Western medicine. Up until more or less the 18th century, the Western doctors had their own way of talking about the human body. They used to talk about the humours, for example, and the different humours that govern the body, the phlegmatic, the sanguine, and so on. And their whole conception of the human body and of medicine was subsequently largely abandoned with the advancement of science, so-called. And I think David saw a huge parallel between traditional Chinese medicine and traditional European medicine, and he uses that parallel to great effect, so that when a doctor comes to visit a member of the Jia family, they sound a bit like an old-fashioned doctor in a 17th or 18th century English work. And that's an example of how he's trying to smuggle in. It's almost like an example of cultural sleight of hand. He's using a Western cultural parallel to enable his reader to gain access to the Chinese in an easier way. But it's quite a hard process. I tried to imitate him in the last 40 chapters myself. And perhaps the most controversial aspect of David's translation was his attitude towards color, because of course from the very first word of the title of the novel, Hong, the novel is like red. It's red. What's red and white and black all over, whatever that riddle is, Hong Lao Meng, it's red. It's a very red novel. And of course red is also the color of revolution, and of the Chinese national flag and goodness knows what else. And so there have been numerous articles written attacking David for not translating Hong as red. I mean, you'd think it was an elementary mistake or something. And there are articles like saying, Hong Lao Meng li de Hong wang na li chu le, where has all the red gone, It's a bit like, where have all the flowers gone, And it's considered to be almost a crime. But you see, David spells out in very clear detail why he chose to do this, because he says, and I've already mentioned this, that the associations of the color red are so very different from the ones that are the associations of the word hong. And he says they're often much closer. The associations of hong are often much closer to English colors like green and gold. So he actually calls the first volume the Golden Days, because they are the sort of the days of great prosperity, the days of great happiness in the family. And when Jia Baoyu goes to live in the garden in the Da Guanyuan, and he calls his little cottage the Yi Hong Yuan, literally the courtyard where one takes joy in red. He calls it green delights. So he changes red into gold, he changes red into green, and this really offends some Chinese readers. They really feel they've been cheated of their redness, But David he says in his introduction, I couldn't think of a better way of doing it, because if I translated red all the time, if I translated hung all the time as red, I feel I would be misleading my readers, because red doesn't mean the same as hung. It's a very subtle point, and I think one has to try it again to look at the underlying motivation. He's trying to be truthful to his author in a more subtle way, not just word for word. He wants the reader, the English reader, to understand the figurative sense of the word hung, not just the literal sense. And in that sense, he's trying to get at a deeper level of meaning. And that's what he does throughout the novel. I thought I would end by looking at what I call, if you look at page 5, I say that no translation is possible without a deep understanding of the text. I mean, this sounds like the statement of the absolute obvious, but the number of times people embark upon a translation without really having any idea what the book means, I mean, and especially in the case of Hong Lemeng, I think to set off on a translation of a novel like Hong Lemeng without having at least some sort of intuitive feeling as to what the book really means, you just never get anywhere. And I think in that respect, David had the advantage of having read and studied the novel ever since he lived in Peking in the late 40s. I shall talk about that tomorrow. But he had a very deep personal acquaintance with the novel and knew it very well, and had by the time he started to translate it, he was already nearly 50 years old. He would have been 50 in 1973, and so he had a more mature perception of what it was all about, and he'd experienced life, and he'd read very widely in both Chinese and Western literature, and he had his own views as to what the novel was about. And I've quoted from one of his essays, halfway down page 5. He wrote rather a nice essay, and he says that it's halfway down after the line that says 1963. It is a tale about a gifted and sensitive young man who, through contemplation of the 12 registers of the passions, represented by the 12 categories of female characters in the registers of beauty, and through the experience of disillusionment, attains a state of mystic contemplation and of liberating peace. The passionate monk, Qing Seng, whose spiritual odyssey is sketched out in the first chapter, is Baoyu himself. So, you see, David was not afraid to say in quite simple language what he considered to be the main message, the underlying meaning of the novel. He was not a kind of primarily he was not an intellectual. He was someone who loved literature with a passion, and he could say simple truths like this without being afraid of kind of letting himself down. Another critic who wrote wonderfully about this novel is the late Anthony Yu Guofan. And David was always a good friend of Anthony Yu's. They shared the same perspective. And the same is true of David and C.T. Xia Zhijing. These are all people who were not afraid to describe the spiritual message of the novel. They weren't going to be sucked into the kind of absurdities that a lot of Hongxie-jia are sucked into. I'm not going to talk a great deal more because it's been quite a long day and I think I've said pretty much as I have to say, but I think I'll end up by drawing your attention to something on page 6, which is, I've not done many valuable things in my life, but one of the most valuable things I've done was to persuade the student I mentioned earlier, who's not here today, Connie Chan, to travel all the way to Oxford and interview David. I think she's one of the only people who's ever interviewed him. And she asked him a lot of interesting questions, and he replied at great length, and it was all recorded and transcribed in her MPhil thesis. And I'm really glad I did that, because it's one of the few records there is of how he thought about being a translator. I've also made a video recording myself, and in order to do that I had to cheat, because every time I sat, you know, the number of times that David's wife and my wife, his daughter, said to me, "John, you really should sit down and interview David," because we would talk for hours and hours and hours. I probably sat down and talked to him for about 1,000 hours, you know, and about his life and about everything. And every time I said to him, "David, why don't we just sit down and I record it?" He said, no, absolutely not. He refused point blank. And he wouldn't. So the only interview he had ever done was with Connie Chan. And he did it because he thought she was such a nice person, and she was very modest. And she said, "I don't know anything about anything, but I've come all this way because my supervisor told me to come and," you know. And so she was very, very modest and unacademic. And he took a liking to her immediately and just sat down and said everything that was necessary. So it's all there. But later I thought, I really should get him on video. And I knew he'd say no. So I cheated. I said to him one summer when I was staying there, 1977. No. What am I talking about? 2007, sorry. My memory is terrible. I said to him one day, "David, I've just bought this new camera. I'd just like to practice. Would you mind?" So I sort of tricked him into sitting down, and then I started filming him, you see. And he started saying some very interesting things about his days in Peking. So I had the camera rolling. I mean, I really was the first time I'd used it, so it's a terrible piece of filming. But he got up after 10 minutes and said, "Oh, this is rubbish. I'm just talking nonsense. No one's interested." He was that kind of person. Luckily, his wife, Jean, was sitting there in the room, and she said, "David, just sit down and shut up. I mean, carry on. It's absolutely fascinating. I've never even heard most of these stories myself." So he sat down again, and he talked for an hour, and I have it all on video. I'm try and show some of it to you tomorrow, but you know, I think it's, you know, one of my hobby horses, one of my themes during these lectures has been that it's time we treated translators as human beings and not as insects, you know. And I think that it's wonderful to have letters and to have documents of that kind, but to have an actual interview, a recording of an interview, and a video is also very precious, you know, because, you know, it's always good to see people in the flesh. And, you know, for example, when you see the video, if I manage to get it together tomorrow to show it to you, you'll see that he was extremely morose. I mean, he was really going, oh, he was terribly miserable. And you see, he often was. He was one of those people who suffered from incredible depression, and he would often, you know, wander around the house complaining and moaning about life, you know, and only his family would say to him, "Oh, do shut up, stop being so miserable, you know. It's a lovely day, let's go outside and prune the apple tree or something." And he would have to be constantly helped by other people to regain some kind of sense of cheerfulness, because he was a very melancholic individual. And I wrote his obituary for the London Times, in which I said that he was someone who was both hugely hindered and also hugely inspired by a deep sense of melancholy. And you know, I've known many very brilliant people who also suffered from a similar kind of deep melancholy and a deep sense of self-doubt and dissatisfaction. I mean, the number of times I heard David Hawkes, perhaps the most brilliant person I've ever known in my life, say to me, "Oh, I've never done anything worthwhile in my life. I'm useless. I can't translate. I can't do anything. I'm just hopeless." That's the kind of person he was. And you see, I can say that and people can refuse to believe me. But if you get to see the video, you'll see that he's very quite melancholic, you know. And then suddenly he'll just come alive and light up and be very funny. And this is his personality. And I'm very pleased that I've somehow managed to get these two records of what he was like. And so I shan't bother to read it because it's rather long, but he was a very good storyteller, so the interview is very interesting, and I've given you some extracts from it. I think I'll end by referring to the paragraph on page 7 where I talk about building a world. Hong Lam is a very, very long novel, and in that novel, Tsai Sui-chin really creates a complete world. A world of the imagination, but also a world that's based on memory, so therefore it's a real world. And it's what Wang Guowei would have called a jingjie, you know, more than a world, it's a realm. And I think that in the end, you know, the great lesson, one of the great lessons we can learn from David Hawkes is that he patiently devoted himself to the recreation of an entire world. As I think you know, earlier in one of my lectures, I mentioned what I called at the time Leonardo da Vinci's definition of genius, which was eternal patience. Now, actually, it's Michelangelo, as somebody very kindly pointed out to me the other day. I think it was you, wasn't it? Yeah. And so whether it's Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci or Raphael, who cares? The point is that they said it, and it's true. And that, you see, David was a genius. I mean, he's the only person I've known personally and closely who I would, without hesitation, call a genius. And he was also an extraordinarily painstaking and patient and hard-working and relentlessly perfectionist artist with words. So he did know the art of eternal patience, and he applied it in every day of his working life. And he was rigorous, but he was also incredibly creative and imaginative, so that he wanted every page that he translated to come to life, so that people could feel the living inspiration of Tsai Sui-chin as it was reenacted, as it was channeled by David Hawkes. And I want to leave you on that note with a small anecdote, which is that my wife, who passed away a little over a year ago, refused to read the translation of Hong Lam over many, many years. Even though it was done by her father and her husband, she just wasn't interested. I suggested it many, many times. Why don't you read the Story of the Stone? Oh, and somehow it fell on deaf ears. However, in the last months of her life, when she was in hospital and very ill, she said, "Why don't you read me the Story of the Stone aloud?" So I did, in a rather sad hospital ward. And I think it's what Solzhenitsyn calls cancer ward. And so I read it. I read 31 chapters of the novel alive. And I'm not telling this story in order to be sort of, asking for your, condolences or sympathy. I'm telling it because what was so extraordinary about it and what made us laugh on almost every page was that Rachel could hear her father's voice. She could hear his tone of phrase all the time because he was speaking as a living person, and it was a live voice. And for example, I remember there was one scene where Jia Baoyu goes to talk to his mother, Lady Wang, with whom he doesn't have a very close relationship. But in the course of this scene, he says something like, he had a long dialogue and a long speech by Bao Yu, and the translator adds in brackets, something like, he spoke at some length to his mother, in brackets, it was a conversation in which the words "I want" appeared rather frequently. And I thought, both Rachel and I thought, that's exactly the kind of expression that David would use. So when I went home that evening, I took the trouble of checking the Chinese, and of course it's not there at all, He just put it in because he was in the mood, he was a bit carried away, so he just added it. And I mean, I think that if I was to go back now, in my old age, and reread that translation from beginning to end, I could probably find examples like that on every page, because he was so swept away by the experience of creating this world that in which living people spoke and had feelings and had sorrows and joys and pleasures and so on and so forth, that sometimes he just couldn't help himself, He just chucked something in for good measure, for the sheer hell of it, as he once said to me. He kept, because he was speaking with complete authority, because he felt totally justified, because he was reincarnating the voice of Tsai Soe-Chin, and that is the sign, that is the privilege of a great master of translation, such as he was. I'm not saying we can all do that, but he did, and he got away with it. So, as the French say, hats off to him, chapeau. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.